Hello, I want to welcome everyone to the Disabilities panel, Writing an Accessible Story. Here we're going to talk about a lot of things concerning disability and misrepresentation in fiction, including how to approach writing about disabilities without having one, and how to approach writing about disabilities with a disability. We're also going to touch the subject on world building, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, and how to create an accessible story for everyone, even if our world isn't accessible. How to recognize harmful ableism in stories, and what to do when we encounter harmful stereotypes if we are beta reading, for example. So yeah, welcome everyone. I'm quite excited. I think this is a great panel and you're going to enjoy it thoroughly. I'd like to present Suzannemiller. She identifies with the pronouns she, her. Being a suicide attempt survivor, recovering addict, and someone who lives with disabilities, CRPS and PTSD due to it after a work accident at 31, she channels her pain and past into her work and endeavors to help others do so as well. Most recently, a Southern Gothic short story of hers was featured last year in screenwriter Sam L. Reed's crime anthology. And she has an upcoming novel being published next year by Inked in Grey. Acetilton Ratcliff identifies with the pronouns they, them. They have bylines at Huffington Post, IO9, Popsci, Fireside Fiction, and more. Their mid-case struggles with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, dysautonomia, endometriosis, and a whole host of other comorbidities. With her husband, they co-own an in-home veterinary practice called Harper's Promise, focusing on the end-of-life care and euthanasia. They have a book about caring for a new puppy coming out later in 2021 from Tiller Press. And here with us is also Nicole Pagán-Aponte, who identifies with the pronouns she, her. As a freshman, she was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and chronic iron deficiency anemia. In 2018, she was selected to participate in Harvard Business School Summer Venture in Management program and as a Forbes Scholar. She uses her passion for writing to advocate for the inclusion of young professionals with disabilities and chronic illness. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here with us today.
Thank you for having us. I'm so excited to be here. Yeah.
Same.
So, what are common misconceptions people have when it comes to a person with a disability?
The common thing is that people focus too much on what is happening to their body and like the medical appointments and the medical process and or the accident or whatever caused it itself. And then that there's not much concentration on all the layers outside of those things. And when someone has to go home and be at home, or when someone has to be around friends or other people, when someone is also in limbo and something happens to them, but it's not quickly diagnosed, that can be tricky as well and is not covered a lot. So the misconception, I think, would be that things are, faster than they are. Really, I think sometimes I've known many people, and even myself, this has been my experience, that it takes years sometimes to properly diagnose someone. Wow. And really get them the proper help and means of treatment. And I think in film, especially, that's very hard for people to cover because there's a limited amount of time. But in books, I see it definitely covered better in memoir, but I haven't really seen it covered very well in fiction. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of times the speed of things and the summing up of things is done for people's comfort level.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what a disabled person looks like. And I think there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. I think the world is very inaccessible. And so people who are disabled don't frequently have the opportunity to exist in the world if they have to use accessibility devices like wheelchairs or walkers, or they have to actually like be out in the world and they have maybe a visible disability. And so that contributes to a lack of disabled people kind of in the real world. But I think because we assume that disabled people are going to be disabled in a way that is visible, we also erase people that have invisible disabilities. And there's a lot of us. Disability affects everybody. It affects every minority group. It affects every age, every gender, every single person that could possibly exist. We like to joke a lot in the disability community that disability, if you're not disabled now, you're going to be disabled eventually, because that is the nature of getting old and old age and your body breaking down on you. So I think the biggest misconception is what we look like and what a disabled person is, I guess.
Yes, definitely. I love that you brought that up because it's what I was going for as well. I mean, the biggest misconception for me is that everyone who has a disability, you're gonna see them and know that they have them. Most times that's not the case. It certainly isn't the case with me. So I've had a lot of people afterwards like find out and be like, "Oh, you have a disability, but wait, no, you're good." And I also have something like that. So maybe you don't have it. I'm like, okay, I guess you're my doctor now. so so that's something that happens a lot. And like Ace was saying, that's something that we talk about a lot, just like we talk about how someday you might be disabled by age and by your conditions. So it's something that everybody's going to go through probably. And it's something that we just started preparing for a lot earlier, I guess. And I
Yeah.
guess, yeah, I guess the other one would be how disabilities have to be cured. I think some
Mhm.
people believe that, and I think that's a very ableist time kind of mindset. Most of disabilities don't have to be cured, but rather we adapt to them and just learn to live with them, and they become part of who we are, and we just
Yeah.
embrace them like that. So I think
Yep.
that's another big one that people misunderstand when they think, oh, disability, I have to do something to help this person get cured, and that's not how it goes.
Yeah, I think there's this idea that a disabled person is someone who is really helpless and has to rely upon other people. But given how inaccessible and ableist the world is, we are incredible problem solvers. Like, I don't think I've ever met a disabled person that hasn't had to come up with some amazing way to exist in the world, because the world doesn't exist for us. So I think that's a really great way of thinking about it and talking about it. We're really we're an incredible group, and we don't all need to be fixed. Obviously that is something that I think a lot of non-disabled people have an immediate sort of like gut reaction to. So if that's the gut reaction that you're having right now, breathe through it. I know it's a tough one. And I know that we can probably provide some links and some writings about that concept of not every disability needing to be fixed, because that's a big concept for a lot of people.
And you see that a lot in media, where people have this support group that rallies behind them, and they have this whole team and entourage that's helpful. And that's a real misconception as well. I think it can be really difficult to have a support group. And then you have the other factor that you don't want people around you because you feel like they only remember you like you were, and you're not going to be that person anymore.
How does being a person with a disability intersect with other identities of a person, like gender, race, and religion?
I think that we were just like touching the surface on this topic earlier. We as a whole, all of us have uh, many different identities that coexist with each other. When we're thinking of a person who has a disability, it just becomes another identity that you decide to own and embrace, like we were saying. And when it comes to adding these other layers in terms of gender, race, religion, what you can see is different burdens that come to that person because they have this gender or this race or this religion. Just for example, when we're thinking about race, me that I'm Hispanic and I know a lot of first generation people who are disabled or have a disability, one thing that quickly layers on top of having this disability and wanting to show the world that you're capable of so much is taking in this burden of being the first in your family that has to make it and has to show that all the work that your parents have done has been for something. So you're just basically layering up different things of yourself that just have to in some way coexist. And I think that's something that we all do struggle, even if we do not have a disability. But when you add that other layer, you just have an additional, I want people to see how capable I am and not think of my disability first, but of me as a person. And then everything that I embrace with that. So I think that's just an example of how they just coexist together.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. You know, as somebody who is white, my experience of being disabled is going to be completely different from anybody who has another minority group status. And you know, I think it's important that when we're having these discussions that we still recognize like places of privilege that we have. You know, I know that my whiteness within our current framework and structure of existence is a level of privilege. So even though I have disability and I'm also queer and I'm also trans, you know, that doesn't change the places where I have privilege as well. So I think there's a lot of intersections, and I really like what you said about owning it, because I think it is a really great identity that can be owned. And I think it's important when we talk about these things that we talk about the percentages of disability that we see, because we also see disability happening more frequently in like people of color, or we see disability happening more frequently in queer communities. And I think, again, there are a lot of conversations to have about that. That's like a whole, we could go down a completely separate road for that one. But intersecting identities, I think, is really, really important, and understanding how that's going to affect our experience as being disabled, or how we have privilege within those intersecting identities, is really important to talk about and recognize.
I'm trying to be mindful to stay in my lane. Of course, I can mainly speak to, you know, experiences I've had as a white female who grew up in religious community. However, I have, you know, taught in other communities, and I've lived in other communities and kind of seen cultural differences, like especially as far as how people view doctors and view, we're seeing that now even, right, with the vaccines and how people trust doctors or don't in certain communities. So I think that's pretty huge. I also think it's big about what people have access to. If you live out in a rural community and you just don't have access to bigger hospitals or places where people are doing various types of things or would know much about your disability or your disease, so that access can be very difficult. And I think religion still, and especially in the US, religion plays a huge part of it. I know in my community growing up in the evangelical community, I knew people that like went to hospitals and had treatments, and my own mom and dad weren't against that. They would go to the hospital. My mom had cancer when I was younger and she had treatment. But I remember there being a lot of prayer, especially in churches, for healing. And a bit of the idea perpetuated that if you weren't healed, that was probably you not having enough faith. I participated at times. I can remember going in when I was first injured and having the pastor pray and pray for my back, which was the first onset of injury. And I can remember really hoping and feeling like this could be it. And then it wasn't, and sort of feeling this being ostracized, I guess, that, oh, well, we
Yeah.
prayed for you and it didn't work out. Something, you must be doing something or not doing something. And yeah, so I know myself, I had to make a reckoning with that, with my faith and with my disability, and that what is healing and what do you do when you don't get healed in the sense that everyone wants you to be. So I think from my own experiences, I think faith and religion play a huge part in how you perceive your disability and your disease. Do you perceive it as something that is inflicted on you because you did something bad? That seems archaic, but it's still very perpetuated in the faith community. And then with gender, the way doctors perceive how women deal with pain, and women being overly emotional causes their diagnosis and their treatment to be different, and for biases to occur. And I think that's even more true in African American and other ethnicities. From what I've read, anyway, studies they're doing, it's worse in other communities. And I think you just have to really explore those things and not think they don't matter. Especially, I know with my disease of CRPS, that was from an injury and surgeries from the injury. CRPS very much is activated by stress or weather or outside factors. So I'm probably acutely aware and always a little more aware about the outside factors, like who's going to cause me stress, what's going to cause me stress as far as weather, how can I not cause stress on myself and make it happen myself. And I've thought of that often in writing, that is so true. That so those things we always think that don't matter, like religion or gender or things that that doesn't matter really. That's probably your fifth risk. It's probably the thing that would actually do the character or do the person in with if they don't think about it. Yeah, it's always made me in writing, and even in life, to be not so much worried about what am I thinking about. I'm more concerned in asking, what am I not thinking about? And I think you have to do that, especially with writing about someone with a disability. What am I seeing face value? And then what am I not seeing that I'm not considering that probably has a big part to play in their life?
What are some things a writer should have in mind when writing a character with a disability?
I am a sensitivity reader, and I specifically focus on disability representation. And I think the best thing that you can do if you're going to write a story that has a disabled person in it is do the research, because everybody's experience of disability is completely different. You know, my hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is going to be completely different from Nicole's generalized anxiety disorder. We don't have the same experiences. What happens in our body isn't the same. What happens in our head isn't the same. The way that we interact with other people because of our disabilities isn't the same. The way that we interact in the world isn't the same. You know, I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, so that means that I use a wheelchair part of the time. And so that is going to make writing somebody like me completely different from writing another character. So if you aren't disabled, and even if you are disabled and it's a different disability than yours, I cannot stress enough that doing the research is so, so, so important.
I do agree, because like Ace was just saying, each experience is different, and not because you might be on a side of this spectrum that is disability, you understand all disability. Like we were saying, there's intersectionality, and then there's the whole difference in the type of conditions that a person might or might not have. So the research is something that it cannot this is a type of writing that you will not get out of research. Maybe you got out of it with another type of book, but if you're doing this and you want to integrate that type of character, even if you're disabled, you will have to do research. You will have to, and in my idea of research is not just reading off websites. Maybe try to connect with people from those communities, see how they are experiencing their struggles and the different things that they are going through. Also, a thing that I think we should keep in mind is that, like we were saying, we as people have multiple identities going on for us. So if you're doing a character who has a disability, what else is that character about? Because no one is just going to have a disability. That's not how it works. Is this character Hispanic? Are they first gen? Are they white? Are they someone who is from Western religion? You need to understand what other aspects of your character are common in play, and then you can start adding the layers up and including their disability as part of their identity. But I think a big no-no would be to just think, okay, I'm doing this character who is disabled. I have their whole profile. This is their profile. That's not how it works. You need to go beyond that and keep in mind that a person is more than their disability. And you have to go farther than that if you do want to add that character in your book.
Yeah, I think I feel like we could just go back and forth for like 15 minutes talking about how important this is. Like do your research. And we live in this incredible age where you have access to so much of the community. You know, you can sit down and you can find somebody who's writing a blog or a journal about exactly what they're going through and what their life is like, or they're doing YouTube videos, or, you know, whatever. It's out there. I promise it's out there. And I think the other thing that I really want to point out is avoiding tropes. I think that there are really, when non-disabled people talk about disability, there are just this set of tropes that keep happening over and over and over again. And they're so one-dimensional, like Nicole was saying. There is this idea that, you know, we're all just sort of obsessed with our disability, and that's the only thing that we have. You know, Hollywood really likes to make an inspiration porn story out of the disabled person and like kill us off before the end. So I think within your research, recognizing what the tropes are and making sure that you're not falling into those tropes is another really important part of writing disability properly.
For sure. And we have to keep in mind that these tropes do feed some of the unconscious bias that are out there that are hindering people with disabilities of finding work, of finding connections, because they see, I don't know, someone who has bipolar disorder as someone who is violent, or they see someone who has some sort of breeding mechanism as someone who's evil, because evil people, the Dark Lord, have breeding things hooked to them, so they're evil. Or I don't know, all these tropes and misconceptions that have been perpetuated by the media, and we have to start walking away from them because you are affecting real people with your writing. And you have to keep in mind the power you hold by being able to just create these characters that people are going to love and consume and connect with them. You need to be very purposeful of why you're using these characters and not just do it for, I don't know, cool purposes. I really don't know what you would do.
For just having the I don't know, for having us in the story.
Right.
I love that. Just being purposeful. That's so important. That's so
Yeah.
important.
I think that so much of their turmoil is interior. Most people are not going to be like screamers and ragers and having fits. A lot of people, they either have the fight, flight, or freeze. And we hear a lot about the fight or flight, people, you know, coming at the problem, fighting it, or running away, but we don't hear a lot about the freeze. And people just sort of sink into themselves and shut down. And I think that's a big thing that I've seen a lot of people do that I fight not doing myself. And especially when I was first graduated, for lack of a better word, from injury and surgeries to then a disability from that. Right. I remember the first time I heard that word was just like someone had set off a bomb in my chest and I was imploding. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And I had to go to work right after because I was still trying to work that same job at that point. And so then you have to withdraw and kind of be into yourself because you can't do the fight, flight, or flight. So you have to just kind of hunker down, get through. And yeah, I think not many people show that very well. Again, the time frames of some people are going to stay in the this is shitty longer. And some people are never going to get out of that. They're not able to. And that helps them deal with it. It helps them have a story. This is bad. This has happened. And it's a rut that their mind is in. And I think all too often, people write these characters that just have these a little bit of that time, and then they're just inspiring people who are going on to do something totally different they never planned on, and they love life in a different way, and they want it to swing up and be inspirational too quickly or too much. So I think that something to consider is that you don't have to make someone negative, or doesn't mean they're negative or dark, in that they are having to live with something and deal with it. It's not over. It's never over. It's like grieving and living with the death of a person. You are always going to carry that in some capacity. You just get better equipment and apparatus to help you carry it. I think there's ways to have it make sense for them, but to also respect that character and show that this is a new way of living they're going to have to deal with. And so that'd be the main thing I think that writers have to keep in mind, and that you also, that your biggest adaptations are not necessarily going to be physical as much as mental. That grappling with getting your mind around that you will not be the same person is much bigger in some senses than the physical things you will have to overcome. I heard a speaker say one time that a comeback is not a go back. And that was groundbreaking for me. And I wished I'd have heard that earlier, because I think so many years I kept trying to go back and be what I was, and that would mean some type of wellness. And then I thought, well, a comeback could be even better in some senses. Not the same ones I thought. It's different. It can be ugly for a time. You don't know what it looks like. There was a before world, how your life was before. Then the problem happens, or the diagnosis happens, or accident, whatever it is, and you try to deny it's going to be that bad, and you try to just keep going on with your life, and it does not work. And you try to then rally support, try to think of things you can do, and come back to the problem and try to defeat it. And then the problem comes back even stronger and has all these things you never knew, the fifth risk, all these things you never knew about it, and you feel defeated. And then finally you rally and you're able to beat it back or overcome it, and you have a new world. And I think what's different about someone at times with a disability is the problem and the thing you're having to overcome is not the disability itself, it's you and how you're handling it.
In world building, what are some tips for writing an accessible world, especially in fantasy and sci-fi?
Sometimes I allow myself to write a short when I get excited about an idea, but I don't work on it fully till I'm done with my major novel I'm writing. And I recently wrote a short about something kind of sci-fi that made me think about this question. I listened to a lot of things to do with CRISPR and how DNA will be altered. And we're even seeing that with vaccines now, and the importance of that technology with the vaccines. I think that's good for people to read up on and keep track of. There's even a whole Netflix series about people who are starting to do that at home with different breeds of dogs and different things. That's in the next few years, that's going to be huge. And I think for futuristic, like writing, even not too far in the future, we have to keep a gauge on increasingly how much of those technologies and abilities will only be available to the rich, because that's always the way it's gone. So you'll have sort of your huge chasm of society then, of not only class, maybe race, but you'll have also the well and unwell chasm. And I think that's something you can't discount when like writing sci-fi or futuristic things, or even fantasy, is sort of the idea that people's bodies and even people, I even thought of it last night. We rode over into a bit of a rougher town to walk, and there's a Dairy Queen there that has non-dairy bars. So we always venture over there. But you go through these very poor areas and you see plasma clinics, blood banks, basically we're already harvesting things from the poor and the needy, right? And yet they don't have access to the things we make from them. And so I think that will only get worse in the next, 10, 20 years, especially. So that's huge to keep your eye on and read about what's new in technology, what's new with medical developments about DNA and RNA research. RNA research is actually getting to be a lot more important too. So yeah, that stood out as one of the biggest things to me, is the medical advancements and who will have access to them. And of course, different things that they'll come up with. They've really done amazing things with people being able to have prosthetics that they weren't able to have before, and medical equipment at home that they weren't able to have, and adapt their lifestyles, in a certain way that they weren't able to and wouldn't have been able to if you were writing a story 50 years ago. I think if anything, this whole last year has shown us that human lives don't mean what we thought they did. And so that has a lot of implications for people's future healthcare, or what's done when someone is disabled. Yeah, I think making sure that your world includes them in some way that could be an overblown way that they're included in our actual world. I think in sci-fi and fantasy, that's always important, is to like take a stereotype and really do it to the max. They sort of make it very similar to what's happening now, and I don't think that'll be the case.
I think that when non-disabled people, and even sometimes when disabled people are writing fantasy and sci-fi or speculative fiction, I think sometimes we end up writing a world that is a lot like the world that we exist in. And I think it's really important to recognize, especially when you're writing speculative fiction like that, you can expand beyond the ableism in this world. I wrote a story for, I said this on another one, and I can't remember if it's Gizmodo or Ion 9, about how all of the spaceships that you see on TV and in the movies are inaccessible. There's staircases to like get down to the bridge of pretty much all of the spaceships in like Star Trek. And that is such a frustrating thing. We've got this world where we're talking to aliens, we can travel to completely different lands, but we have nobody who uses a wheelchair or any sort of accessibility device, and everybody can manage a step down to get to the bridge. Like, that's ludicrous. And I think it's really telling of the world that we live in, that gets reflected into our fiction in a way that erases disability. So I think, I feel like the phrase for this panel is going to be purposeful. I think being purposeful about what you do within the world that you're creating. Disabled people make up, I think I always switch the two. I think it's 20% of the world population and 25% of the American population. So a quarter of the population is disabled. That's a huge amount of people. But it's certainly not reflected in the media that we consume. I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I've seen good disability representation in the sci-fi that I watch or in the sci-fi that I read. So I think, again, just figure out what world you're building and figure out how your characters are going to be, moving through that world. What is it that makes our world inaccessible? What is it? And it's not just stairs. I mean, stairs are certainly part of it, but attitudes are a really big hindrance. The way that we deal with other people is a really big hindrance. So if you are going to write ableism into your world, which is reasonable, it doesn't have to be the same brand of ableism that exists in our earth here and now, but you can also write a world that's accessible, that's allowed. We give you permission.
Definitely, we give you permission. That's that would be awesome. And I think that when we think about this, and how I love how you went to that even if we're doing sci-fi and this made up world, we always do go back to the one we have, because it's like you cannot imagine a color out of the ones that you've already seen, right? Our imagination can just go so far. So I guess it's the same thing. But when you're thinking about it, I guess that how Ace was saying, adding those infrastructural accessible points would be awesome. also, if you do a world that's not accessible, it would be great that you highlight that maybe between the characters, and you're like, this whole world sucks or something like that. I don't know. And then something else that I always go to when I'm watching like the sci-fi movies or reading these books, and you go more towards like the technological side of sci-fi, because right, you might have steampunk and all that. If you go to the tech, you see almost worlds that would be so horrible for people that get overwhelmed with their senses. You have lights and you have neon and you have speakers everywhere, and you can hear someone talking everywhere you go, and it's like that would be so horrible for me. I'm thinking that, oh my god, no. And that's something else that I think we don't think about it a lot when we're doing something, a world that has to be accessible, but making a world that's better or more comfortable for people who are photosensitive or just sensitive of any of the other senses that they're experiencing when they go out into that world would be really awesome, because not because it's in the future, people from the spectrum or people who have neurodiversity stop like existing. That didn't happen. So I think that's something else that we can keep in mind, not making this world one that you cannot step into it and not be overwhelmed by everything that's happening.
That's such a good point. I'm somebody who has a mix of neurodivergence, and then the way that my disability works, I deal with a lot of chronic pain. And if you're having a bad flare day, or if you're anything, um, like too much sound can be so overwhelming. It makes it difficult for me to understand what another person is saying. Doctors' offices, for some reason, are just horrible about this, where they have like TVs on and the volume's turned up and the radio's going, and I'm like, oh my god, I can't understand anything anyone is saying to me. Um, so I carry around earplugs with me that I put in. And so I just imagined, as you were talking, just a quiet world, or a world where I could like hit a button and it's just like all the sound goes down, but everybody's voices get turned up so I can hear them when they're talking to me. Like that would be so perfect. Sign
So
me up.
beautiful.
And how can one recognize harmful ableism in stories?
It's that old thing of, if you're trying too hard, if you're having to really try hard to make it fit, that could be problematic. I think if you're being too stereotypical in some ways, not, and assuming, and even other characters assuming that someone can't do something or doesn't want to do something, or that, I like to think of the thing of different but not less. Are you making someone different but they're not less than the other people? And that's a good rule of thumb to follow.
I just go back to, because I hate it. I hate when disabled characters lose their own autonomy, and they have to be safe, or their problem is that they have a disability, and that's the problem that they're facing, and they are going to be cured or whatever. Just those, that spectrum of ideas that somehow this disabled character, by means of the world they're creating or the person who's taking them through the story, they're somehow better off because they are being helped by an able person. So I think that's the one that really strikes me, and I'm like, no, don't do that. Why are you doing this? Because other things like the tropes we mentioned, maybe you do because you saw a lot and you have to start unlearning the things that you learned through the media. But that one is one that you can be just aware of it in the second. If you had a woman in your story and a man is the one carrying her through the whole story, it would be like, that doesn't sound right. Do the same thing with disabled people. You cannot have an able people just carrying them through the whole story. It's not good. It's completely ableist, and you just lose the opportunity to create an amazing character that has so much depth to them because they've grown and adapted to this condition, and they're doing amazing things in regards of it.
Yeah, I think looking at your character and I actually use the website tvtropes.com just a whole lot because it's a great place. You can just type in disability and it's kind of overwhelming. It's like a Wikipedia of tropes. And you can sit there and you can just go through all of the different tropes that get related to disability. It's kind of an amazing resource. But I think you're exactly right. If you're looking at it and your character is completely flat and doesn't have any dimensionality to it and is being supported particularly by a non-disabled character, it's probably time to stop and do some major edits and some major rewrites and to think about that character. And I think one of the other things that's really important is whenever people write in a disabled character, there's like one disabled character and that's it. Everybody else is non-disabled. And I look around at my life and I'm like, all of my friends are disabled at this point. I've got like 2 non-disabled people in my life because non-disabled people can't deal with you know, having to reschedule at the last minute or having to deal with a friend who is flaky because their body doesn't do the right things or their brain doesn't agree with them. So I feel like that's another really important thing. I call myself a cripple. It's a word that I try to own. So like where there is one cripple, there is more than one cripple. We are never alone.
For sure.
And how should disabilities be approached regarding character arcs? What should and shouldn't be cured? You kind of talked about that, but I would like for you to develop more the idea.
I mean, it will depend so much on the story and so much on the backstory of that character in particular. So you have to keep that in mind. And like we're just owning it by now, being purposeful of what you are creating. Don't just say you have this character who is blind and they are going to be cured by this amazing new set of eyes and whatever. Uh, because then you are making the issue the fact that they were blind and that they have to be cured. So you have to like take a step back if you are going to go with an arc where people will have the opportunity to like use this cure and ask yourself, is this something that I'm doing to cure just blindness? So I'm putting blindness as what is wrong with society, and I'm doing this as an enhancement to everyone who has vision. So a person who is not blind but wants to like be a superhero can get new eyes too and be like this super awesome superhero. So I guess it's that part of, is this something that you're just doing to cure something that in to begin with it doesn't have to be cured from the root? Or is it because of the backstory of your character? Is what they were seeing before they lost their vision very important to them? Do they want to do something again? Or maybe they figured out, actually I love the world better without seeing it. It's too ugly. So you have to go further than just saying, oh, there's blindness. Maybe in my book I cure it. It cannot be blindness is the problem and I'm making a cure. You actually have to create a story around it. And that's why it gets so complicated. You have to create a story for your cure too, and for how it came about and who wants it, and do they have an option to opt out. So you have to just get in it, get in the research, actually create so much backstory into it. And if you're a person who just likes to like throw this here and I made a cure, maybe disability is not for you, because you should be a lot more purposeful of why you're putting it and what's the story and the meaning you want to like convey with it. Because maybe it's a metaphor and blindness does not have to be cured, and you show that it's horrible, but then you have to include that in the subtext of what you're writing. So yeah, if you don't want to do that, if it's a lot of work, maybe that's not an arc that you should be trying to use.
I think there's so much history about the idea of curing disability that informs this topic. There's a couple of different ways that I want to go with this one. The first one is I wrote a story about the lack of disabled doctors in medical school and how medical school is inaccessible. And how frustrating that is because, you know, I had this unicorn of a doctor once who also had hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and she was incredible. She's the only doctor I've ever met who could actually understand what I needed. And, you know, of course, she had to leave medicine because it was too demanding in the current system. So I think that understanding the history of curing a disease is really important. When I was writing that story, there was this fact that just jumped out to me, and it was a study about people who had had spinal cord injuries that were going to leave them paralyzed. And when they asked the emergency room doctors who were dealing with cases like this, the vast majority of emergency room doctors said that if they had injuries like that, they wouldn't want to live. Like they would rather be dead than disabled. And of course, that's going to translate to the care that you give to a disabled person with that injury, right? But when they talked to the people who had those injuries, a vast majority of those people would rather be alive than dead. Imagine that. Living with a disability is better than not living at all. And so I think that we have just this deep unconscious bias towards disability. And I think you really, before you can even write disability, you have to get into understanding why that unconscious bias exists in our world. I think you really have to get into the concept of eugenics. And so this idea of curing a disabled person, or more importantly, the idea that disability shouldn't exist at all and disabled people shouldn't exist at all. You know, America has a very fraught history of eugenics. In many ways, we were the people who inspired the Nazis to do what they did, and we still participate in eugenics today. And when you look at what the Nazis did, you know, they started with disabled people in Germany with the Action T4 program. Before that was the trial run for everything that they did in concentration camps. And so those kind of experiences and that history is part of why we have this obsession with curing disability now. And I think the other two things that you need to know about are the medical model versus the social model. And the medical model talks about how within society, disability is the thing that limits us, and we have to do everything that we can to try and fix the disability. And the social model, which from what I have seen, the vast majority of disabled people who work within disability justice or disability rights or are disability activists, this is what they prefer. The social model is the idea that our disabilities are not what limit us. Society is what limits us, both the attitudes of society and the actual structure of society. And I think that when you start getting into the nitty-gritty of this history and the reason why we look at curing disability the way that we do, you start understanding that it's an incredibly hurtful thing that we do to disabled people to assume that everybody needs to be cured. And, you know, like Nicole said, it really also depends on the story. You know, there are, like, I live with chronic pain. Would I love to not live with chronic pain? Absolutely. But curing that chronic pain means that I would be a completely different human. And being disabled has informed so much of who I am for so long. I don't think that I would want to cure. So again, I think you gotta be purposeful, do your research. There's a lot that goes into the stories of curing disabled people. There's so much below the surface that so many people don't even realize that it's there. So before you even think about touching that as a plot point or as a story, my honest advice to you is don't. There are a million other stories out there. Please tell any of the million other stories about disabled people.
I've changed my mind on what cured means as a person, we have these concepts of what's healthy, what's good, what's a norm. And yet, who are we to say that? Who's to say what's normal, really? And I think I've redefined that a lot for myself. And I look for characters to then redefine that, because I don't think it's not the nature of even being human to cure everything. Eventually, not to sound morbid, but eventually something is going to get you. It's part of being a human being, part of, if you see it in nature all the time, things don't live forever. And if we keep having this idea of curing everything, sometimes rather than maximizing the potential of what we're given, it's a waste of life. And so I myself I don't go around looking for cures. I look for things that will help me live better and make my life not about my disability. And so anything I can do, whether it be taking supplements or swimming in my pool, doing physical therapy, whatever I have to do to help maintenance my disability so that my life is not about it, that's what I do. So I don't look for cures. And I would not write characters that would probably arrive at that either. I have to admit, I have grappled myself for sure about thoughts about cures. And if someone told me tomorrow, well, we could do this to you and you would be cured, it wouldn't be a hands down yes for me right away. I would have to think about that, because what has happened to me, I've gone through a lot of work, and I'm not so sure now that that's, something I would want taken, and that I would even know how to live the other way again. And so you do have to know, what do you think about cures, and if people should seek them, and at what cost? How much is it going to cost that person, and what does it cost the people around them? Should you, run up a lot of medical bills for those around you seeking a cure? And a lot of stories are about that, about other people have a need for you to be well. It helps them know what to do with you. It, fixes a problem. So that's something to consider too when you're writing, that oftentimes you being cured is not just driven by you, or the characters being cured is not just driven by the character, it's driven by their culture and who's around them, and what plans they had, and different things like that. I remember, and I think of disabilities and sickness and different things like that, there's not all this black and white. There's so much gray area people fall into when they can't be cured, or when their life can't go back. And so I think the gray area is very important, of the limbo of there is no cure. There are treatments and there are maintenancing things, but there is no cure. And how are you going to deal with that?
We implant that unconscious bias in people very, very young. And we even do it in our movies and our media. One that I always think about is, oh my goodness, the Pixar movie about Dia de los Muertos. The name is gone out of my head now.
Coco.
Yes. Beautiful movie, right? Like completely a game changer in terms of representation. And I always think about, they had this like sort of off joke with Frida Kahlo, where Frida Kahlo sort of like shows up for a couple of jokes. And, they've made the rules in this world that your body is in the afterworld the way that it is when you die. And Frida Kahlo was a disabled person. She had a serious injury. She wore braces. She, by the end of her life, she was a wheelchair user. And that's not the Frida Kahlo that we got to see in that movie, even though those were the rules that they created in the movie. So it's really interesting, the places where we choose to erase or change or cure disability.
Yeah, and when you bring someone like Frida Kahlo to the Mets, you think, oh, this is a person who they've taken and made it an example of woman's strength and just this femininity awakening. And when they were doing the character, maybe they saw that and they were thinking, oh no, we're not gonna put her on a wheelchair and with the races because she is the strength of the woman. So why couldn't she be the strength of the woman from a wheelchair? That doesn't make any sense. So yeah, you have to think that too, because then you're perpetuating that idea that a person who's walking, who doesn't have those things, is stronger than someone who's using a wheelchair, and that's not how it works.
I really, really hate that the idea that the disabled character dies by the end. Um, it's a really common one. And we joke about it being Oscar bait because the movies where they kill off the disabled character, especially so that the non-disabled like character can have feelings. That's a really big one that just drives me absolutely batty. I cannot stand it. And it's just such a depressing way to think about disability too, that a disabled life isn't worth living, that there's no joy within disability. And it's untrue because that's not what the experience of living with disability is.
I think besides the one I already mentioned for like mental illnesses and all that sort of stuff, another one that I definitely do not like is when the disabled, and I think we already talked about this, but the disabled character is helpless. So they're just like they're in the story, but they don't really are the hero. They need an able person to actually be able to conquer or to be able to do the stuff that they're going to do. So they're not actually the main character. They're just someone who's there with the other one to show that they're pure of heart and they want to help someone else, I think.
I don't know, I'm the hero of my own story, damn it. Um, I feel like a lot of times disabled characters get written sort of as like the plucky side character and the one who's like always making jokes and doesn't get to be somebody with a love interest, doesn't get to be somebody who, you know, has sex or is a sexualized person or a sexualized being. There's just such an erasure of autonomy when it comes to disability. And so I think that is another thing that just makes me so frustrated.
Yeah. Also, don't just throw there that they have a condition, like a mystery condition or something that it makes them how they are because you wanted to explain what they did and why they did what they did. No, 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 no. If you're going to, by some reason, add something, like we said, you need to make this something that's real and do the research and actually don't just make up something and say, oh, this mystery condition that just opened up because no.
I think you can't only write about just who you know about, but I think you have to do due diligence. I think you have to be able to see your weak spots and know, yeah, what do I really know about a transgendered African American person living in New York? But if that's somehow your story that you want to do, you have to learn everything you can learn and try to maybe even talk and interview someone and read as much as you can read and educate yourself. So I think the same thing with people with disabilities. It's not a bad thing, but you can in no way assume that you know much about it if you don't have one. And even and really be cautious, about what you're writing. I thought even not long ago, a friend, I don't know how friendly they are if they said this, but was joking with me that, oh, you shouldn't say disabled. I don't think that's allowed anymore. Like it's not PC. And I quieted the like George on Seinfeld part of my brain that wanted to be like, what? And I just said, when you go to the doctor's office and you sit and have them write that about you, you can call it whatever the fuck you want.
Of course.
And we kind of laughed about it. But I thought to myself, things like that people either write or they say that are so tone deaf to your situation. And you have to educate yourself to not do things like that or to apologize or edit it out when you do, So yeah, you can't just, the same person also texted me one day about his dental surgery or something that was going to be painful. And could I give him some tips on pain because of being disabled? And I said, well, I sent him the little pain scale picture where mine's at a 42 out of 50. dental pain. It's down here. And just said, really, the best thing you can do is ask someone on your same pain scale level for advice. Don't ask me. Things of that nature, like where, oh, I'm having a dental surgery. Suzanne's had a surgery. Let's ask her. Don't make comparisons.
Yeah.
That's huge. That's a huge thing in writing, in life. Don't make comparisons that don't really have any of the same caliber, you know. But yeah, I really try to watch documentaries. I try to get to know people. I try to be authentic as I can when I'm writing about something I don't know. And that as a disabled person, I wouldn't mind someone not disabled writing about people with disabilities. I just want them to do it well and to do their homework. So that's the biggest thing. Don't shy away from it, because I don't know that oftentimes in all the things I've written, I've only written about a couple disabled people. It's not something. I wouldn't say that writing is necessarily an escape for me. I like to dig into things with my writing, but it might be kind of an escape for me on that front. And I don't spend a lot of my writing time writing that. Sort more of my nonfiction I write about that. So all that to say, I think it is important that anyone that wants to and anyone who's interested write about people with disabilities, just verse themselves well in it. Because people with disabilities are not necessarily going to tell that story. They're living it and they're tired. So they're not,
of course,
not going to necessarily be the first thing they want to write. But I'm very appreciative, like when the kid, basically young kid that wrote the cake short story that got made into the movie, I was so appreciative that he did that and that he didn't think, oh, well, this is my mom's friend that went through that. I don't know anything about that. Thank goodness he wrote that. I still watch that movie probably 2 or 3 times a year at least.
Wow.
And it's cathartic for me. So yes, I say go for it and just study up.
If we are a beta reader and we encounter a piece of insensible writing in the manuscript, what should we tell the person and how?
I like this one author and sociologist, Brene Brown. She has some of the most famous TED Talks, but she's very good. And she said something that her therapist told her. It's that, what if we assume that everybody's just doing the best they can? And I think that about a lot of situations, because I think as a beta reader, my first thing would be to be offended, right? And even when my friend texted me about the dental work, my first thing was like to be offended, but then I tried to remember, what if they're just doing the best they can in life, you know? So I think come at it with that this person more than likely is not intending to be offensive or not inclusive or stereotypical. And think of, this comes from my old school teaching days. I try to think of any advice I give someone, doing it in the tone that I would do if I told one of my 3rd graders. And when I used to talk to my 3rd graders about writing, whatever it is they were learning, my number one thing was always that they came away with dignity, that they didn't feel any shame about it, and that they learned something they would carry to another piece or another work. And those 2 things, as a beta reader about any type of work, if you do that, I think you'll come at it with a good tone. Because what you don't want to do is make them just feel like they shouldn't have tried to write about it at all, and try to pick a constructive way to help them sort of reframe it and give them some insight, and be willing to be transparent. If there's something personal that you can relate to it, to help, change their mind on it a little bit, that's the best thing. When they were trying to change the laws in California about gay marriage, they found that with all the media that we have nowadays, still the best way to change people's vote was door-to-door talking to people.
Wow.
And going and knocking and having someone transgendered or someone in the gay community or a married couple who was gay go and talk and show that person they're just a person. And so I think that'd be important with your beta reader to be, just very human and just show them, hey, I'm a person and you had this in here, but that's my experience was really kind of this. And I'm wondering, if we could tweak this or alter this or offer, I'm big about resources, offer them a book or a film, something that would give them some resources to go by. Because if the person knew how to not do that, they wouldn't do it. So you can't just tell someone, you can't have that in there, So yes, share a personal story if you can. Make sure you don't shame them and give them resources. That'd be my things.
I feel so passionately about this one as a sensitivity reader. Beta readers are wonderful. Beta readers are deeply important to the process of writing a story or a book. But if you are writing any, not just disability, if you're writing any group that you don't belong to, or even if you're writing part of a group that maybe you belong to, but there could be other experiences within that group, go pay a sensitivity reader. Just do it. Pay them the money. I promise you, the vast majority of us work on flexible scales for payment plans, especially for people who are, not working with a publishing house or just writing a little story. Pay somebody within the group of marginalized identities that you are writing. And if you're a beta reader and you encounter something that seems ableist or racist or homophobic or any other of the isms that we encounter in the world, note it. Make sure you call the writer out. You don't have to be a jerk about it, but you absolutely, it's your job to note discrimination where it happens. And writing ableism is discrimination. And so it's your job to write it out. And maybe it's not your job to get into the nitty gritty of, educating this person about the medical and the social model and eugenics and all of that jazz. But it is important for you to call it out. And it is important for you to say, this story needs a paid sensitivity reader, somebody from this group. This story needs to go through, at very minimum, beta readers that are from this group. You can't just throw a story out there. It's just, you can, but it's going to be messy and it's not going to be good. And most likely, because ableism is just so deeply ingrained into us as an unconscious bias, you're going to do something that's ableist. And it's not like a personal failing. It's just the nature of existing in the world that we exist in. So fix it. Do the work to fix it. Know that it's there. Know that you can't really do anything about the fact that it's there. It's within me. I have to confront internalized ableism all the time, and know that there are steps that you can take to fix it.
Yep, I agree. And I can give you my own example. I always write rhythm fiction. I just started writing, well, not started because we're ending it now, but this was my first nonfiction book that I was doing. And I really wanted to basically share the story of all the women I had been inspired from the moment I was diagnosed through my whole journey through my university, and how their path towards success really helped me get through all those moments when I thought, so how do I adapt to my own things now? And I was doing that. I was bringing them together. I was doing it from a place of also reflecting on my own experiences and all of this. And I had the blessing that my developmental editor with the publishing agency that I was working with also was a person with a disability. She had a disability, and it was awesome to have her reading my book and reading the things that I wrote, because I was writing, sure, about my own perspective, and I have a lot of experience in the part of more unapparent disabilities that have to do with the mind and the spectrum, so I can be very purposeful about that. But then when I go into more physical disabilities, I do have to do that research. I do have to understand, and I have to be very careful when I'm writing about them, even when I'm quoting the woman who I just did an interview with, because they might also be, like Ace was saying, having some ableism in their own heart, and they don't even know it. I might have it too. And when I was writing this one piece that I thought it's one of the the ones that I love the most, and I was very like touching when I was writing her story and just using the words that she had said. I'm sitting with my editor and she tells me we have to work on this piece because it's good, but I think there might be some inspiration porn here. And I'm like, no, what are you saying? What? No, this cannot be true. I need to read this again. I'm going to scrap it. This is horrible because I don't want that to be the book. And I was like, no, what? And even someone who has gone through the experience can have that happen to them. Like Ace was saying, we do have that little piece of ableist still here that we have to take out of ourselves, our mind, and our hearts. So I was super thankful of having that reader, in this case that editor, who was a sensitivity reader and that could call me out, because this is not something that I want to do. This is not what I want the book to be about. But I know that by just being just so, you know how we go in this just states that we're just writing and we're in the passion of the moment, and we just go there and we put it in our folder and we're so proud of it and we don't even look back at it. And sometimes it's just hitting there. So it's not something I wanted to do. And I was so grateful to have someone call me out on it because I had not doing that third reading and being able to see it. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to say it because they're going to be mad at me or they are just not want me as a beta reader, don't think that. I, in my experience, I was very thankful. I was able to do a much better chapter thanks to that feedback. And I'm so proud of that chapter now. So that's the experience that I hope you will have with any author that you're calling them out on this. And if that's not the case, well, maybe this is not the book you want to be reading, right? This is not the author that should be writing this because it's a very sensitive topic. There are things that we have to unlearn to be able to convey the things that we want to write better. And if they're not in that state of mind that I need to unlearn and learn to be able to deliver a good book, maybe they shouldn't be writing it. And if they snap at you and they don't want you reading any more of the book, then you just put your hands up. You did the job that you had to do. You called it out, and you move to the next project.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the writer side of things, because you're right. Like you can feel so protective when you write, these pieces. And if you get criticism from a sensitivity reader or a beta reader that talks about, the ableism in the piece or the internalized ableism in the piece or whatever, and if it makes you upset or angry or if you feel defensive about it, I think that that's a really normal reaction for humans that live in our society. But I think what you do with that reaction is the important part. And so just step away. If you're frustrated or angry or you feel like it's unfair, before you write an email, before you respond to your sensitivity readers or your beta, just step away. Go outside, take a walk, come back to it tomorrow. And then, you can do better and be better in the world. But Nicole was totally right. Like, maybe it's not the story for you if you can't take the criticism.
Yeah, and like this is something that we were talking about in another panel when we were talking about accepting those positive feedback and just that comment and criticism on your work. This is your baby. You're very passionate about it, and at least in my view as a writer, I'm very good at taking comments and feedback. I don't think there has been a comment that I haven't been like, oh yeah, I think I can get something out of this comment. Like I'm that type of writer. I think that people tell me things to grow. So I always take out something of a comment. But if you're someone that might not be that type of person because you're very protective or very passionate, you just have to take a moment. Just let the comment simmer, take half a day, 2 days, and read it again. And read it from a place of kindness and caring, of someone who doesn't want to see things that might be harmful to other perpetuated, and not as a personal attack on your amazing work. It's still amazing. It's not a comment to you as a writer. It's just someone trying to protect a community.
like a million times over from the mountaintops, I want to shout what you just said about, it's not a direct criticism of your writing, it's making sure that you're not perpetuating harm. Like, do no harm with your writing, like that. In my heart, I feel that in my heart.
We need that oath. We need that.
Do you have any advice for young writers who want to write about their disability but don't know where to start?
I would say being involved, pick one mode of social media, whether it be Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. I myself have found a lot of disabled community on Twitter. And I think starting to share your story or relate with people in those short snippets like that it requires you to do on Twitter is helpful. And even starting a blog that maybe you don't show to anyone for a while. I myself have had one ongoing for a while. I know it goes out on email to people. It doesn't bother me, but at first, the first year or so, I didn't really share that much with people. So that can be a great way. And also maybe even just making a short video diary for yourself that no one watches for a while, but just you. That can be helpful. And there's something to be said for the rehearsing and talking about something. It makes it more of a story and takes away the power and the potency of it in the same way. So I think sometimes people don't share because they don't like the emotions it unlocks. But I say the more you share, the more that just becomes a natural part of your life. Even 2 years ago, I wouldn't be talking to you. It would have been too much for me, and I'd have probably cried a lot and not been able to get through it. And with time, with sharing more of myself, with some excellent CBD in the morning under my tongue as well. I love the CBD. Yeah, you find ways that the story doesn't control you and control your emotions about it. I'm very big about writing my way to wellness, in a sense. Overall mental wellness mostly. We can write a lot of things we can't say. And that's why I think it's so important for young writers, and especially young disabled writers, to start that early, because there are going to be a lot of things you wanted to do possibly physically that maybe you're not going to get to do, but it doesn't have to affect you creatively. And so when you write, you can see, well, hey, that's just one limitation, but I have all these other things I can still do. And it helps give you a good sense of pride as well. You never know where your support is going to come from. You will think it's going to be these people that you've known, and then you'll meet someone new and they're totally there for you during that time.
I think the hardest advice about being a writer, and the best advice about being a writer, is just write. It doesn't matter how frequently you do it. It doesn't matter if you're in a coffee shop or at home, or if you grab 5 minutes before you go to bed. It doesn't matter if you're writing science fiction. It doesn't matter if you're writing nonfiction. Just sit down and write. That's the place where you can start, and you can figure out everything else later. Plot comes later. Learning how to write characters comes later. Finding an agent, doing all of that stuff, figuring out what genre you want to write in, figuring out what your voice is. All of those things will come, but you have to just write first. That's the most important part.
Yes, I think that for sure that's it. And I know that this is a scary process. And in my case, it was horrible because I definitely did not tell anyone, not even my family, about my diagnosis as I was getting them. And so this book was sort of my, I guess, coming out project. And everyone was going to like find out. So not even my parents knew this. And it was just my own fears of how we were saying here, thinking that the world is now going to see me as incapable, thinking that the world is now going to think that I'm not fit for the job that that I want, or the goals that I want to pursue. So it's a scary process, because when you want to start, maybe you're having those same thoughts that I had of, oh no, now my supervisor is going to find out, or people are going to be able to read this before they give me an interview or whatever it is. But I have to say that in my case, it has been a great experience of growth and just learning to actually be happy and accept more of who I am, and just increasing that honesty that I have with myself. I've been able to understand my own my own conditions a lot better by just being honest about them with others and with myself, because I just realized by writing that many times I just wanted to be dishonest. This is not affecting me. This is not happening. This is not something that is actually going on with me, because I'm the exception. I don't have this, right? Because we are in this denial. So I think that with writing about it came a lot of ownership, came a lot of growth. And I think that, like Ace said, it's just about starting to write a little bit each day, a word to words. If you're someone that might be daunted by that white screen in front of you, maybe use a transcriber. I did that a lot when I was beginning, just because I wanted to practice how I would tell my story. So in the end, it's just that, you telling your story. So find that narrative and start at it. It's yours. Nobody can take it away. And something that you could be facing, that I know I did, I still do every day that I talk about this, is that you might think, oh, maybe I'm not disabled enough to be writing about this. And that's not how it works. Just like with neurodiversity, with the spectrum, it's not I have to be here to be able to talk about my experience. No, your experience is valid, what you've gone through is valid, and there's someone who's probably very similar to you out there, and in the end, taking your story out is going to help them. So just think about that. You're going to be helping someone else, and that really helps me write every day.
I'm so glad that you said that, because the work of writing about hard things like disability and being honest about the truthfulness of your story, it makes you really recognize that pretty much nobody has experienced something that is completely unique to them. Like, there are people who have had versions of what you've experienced, and you're making them feel less lonely by what you're writing. Like, I will occasionally get emails, and they're like my favorite thing in the entire universe, when people will just say, oh, you made me feel not alone. Oh, you helped me realize. Like, it's the best thing. It's the best thing. So you're not alone. Your story is totally valid, which, like, such an important point. And by writing, you're being honest with yourself, sharing your story, and you're just becoming part of this big community.
Thank you
so
very much.
much.